number of organizations that are involved in steering the anarchy in ways that will essentially allow us to produce some degree of political change. Other pieces of the global governance architecture include things like international organizations. We talked about the UN, non-governmental organizations, other civil society organizations, and even indeed individuals. And you can make an argument that individuals play a role. If you were to look, for example, at the influence of some particularly important individuals for charitable foundations, for example, Bill Gates, they are able to produce social and political change at a fairly large scale because of the resources that they hold. You could also arguably argue that this somewhat includes things like celebrity activism as well. You can start to see that that includes those same things. Today, what we're going to do is shift away from the international organizations and look at what we might call global civil society. And this is a term that really, if you were to go back in the international relations literature 25, 30 years ago, you would not see a lot of discussion of global civil society, right? You would not see a lot of discussion of this. The notion that there is a set of NGO, international organizations, and so on that operate outside the borders of state and act like a civil society does in a domestic context is essentially a relatively new concept. And today we're going to look more at questions about what we mean by global civil society. Why is this relatively a new concept? As probably most of you are aware, if you look at international relations more generally, most of the time international relations is usually state-centric. In other words, governments matter more than international organizations. And certainly if you go back in the international relations literature in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, you saw relatively little discussion about the role of NGOs, international organizations, and a much more discussion of a state-centric model of this. And certainly realism itself tends, as a theoretical concern, to take states much more seriously than international organizations, NGOs, and so on. In general, this is a theoretical frame question. If you come at this from a liberal internationalist vantage point, you tend to take NGOs and international organizations more seriously. If you come at this as a realist, you tend to say they're less important than states, and that states are the ultimate arbiters. There are some realists who make an argument in certain versions of realism that these organizations can have an impact, but generally speaking, they make the argument that they matter a lot less than states. Right? And so this is generally a presupposition of kind of liberal international politics. What's interesting about this is all of us understand what we mean. What do we mean when we say civil society exists at the domestic level? What do we say? What is civil society as a term of art? DJ?
I don't really raise my hand, but I'll take a shot at it. I guess it's like a group of people that like live under a law and have a order, I guess.
Okay. All right. What do we mean civil society, Andrew?
Nonprofits and foundations.
Nonprofits and foundations. We usually think that they operate. They're essentially political actors not funded by the state, at least not directly funded by the state, and they exert some degree of policy change. Nonprofits, NGOs, they generally operate along those lines. Some international organizations, arguably charities, universities, foundations, and in some cases companies fall along what we might consider global civil society, or at least international civil society. So when people talk about civil society in a domestic context, they tend to talk about the leaders of foundations, grant-making organizations, nonprofits, NGOs, international organizations, and a whole series of other organizations. If you were to use the term civil society in Philadelphia, you'd find an array of different organizations that kind of exist in the social civil society milieu. Almost all of them push for some degree of political and social change in a domestic context. What's changed is that it has now moved to the international context. You have internationally based NGOs that are producing political change. You have internationally based companies that are looking for political change. And we're going to talk about companies first, then shift to NGOs, and look really about how NGOs talk about advocacy networks. That is a dramatic change. You move from a society under which that happens at the domestic level, that happens at the international level. Can you give me some examples of international NGOs? USAID is a U.S. government agency, donates funding to NGOs. Come on, these are the big ones. Think about the big ones. Andrew.
Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch is one of the biggest ones, right? What does it do? It documents human rights abuses around the world, pressures governments. Amnesty International is another example of one. Anything else? What's a very big one that's involved pressuring the U.S. military? National Committee on the Red Cross, right? The National Committee on the Red Cross exists within these organizations, and you think about them, what are they? They're non-profit, non-governmental organizations existing at the international level trying to produce social and political change, right? And really, when we think about transnational activism, we're thinking about them, organizations that take it upon themselves to try and force governments to do things, even though, in fact, actually, there's no direct supernatural authority that can, in fact, make them do so. This kind of blurs a distinction in this analysis of transnational activism between what we might consider high and low forms of politics. If you were to go back to the traditional diplomatic distinction of it, high forms of politics were between states, low forms of politics were between nonprofit organizations. So in the Cold War, it was very common to say that the high politics were between Washington and Moscow, and the low politics were between U.S. nonprofits and Russian nonprofits, U.S. universities, Russian universities. As an interesting piece in this, universities play an important role in international activism. You often see universities form sort of networks, universities form transnational links. They play an interesting role in these sort of cases. That distinction between high and low politics has begun to be blended over time. In the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen increasing cases where governments have made common cause with important nonprofit organizations and NGOs to produce social political change. Interesting examples of this include Canada and the Landmines Convention. Canada worked with a number of international NGOs to advocate their own language at the Landmines Convention. So when the Landmines Convention was created, it was a Canadian government initiative, but it took language and text produced by NGOs in concert with NGOs to essentially produce this form of social and political change. So when we think about what do we mean by kind of transnational civil society, we really mean a combination both of companies and also private organizations and for-profit companies and not-for-profit international organizations that are designed to work with governments and produce political change. And we're going to come to the piece at the end, the Kekensky-King piece, will tell you a little bit about how they do so and the languages that they're framing. I'll try and give you some examples to help you understand how, in fact, actually that happens. We're going to start by looking at the role of companies, because companies are really important in transnational activism, in part because they're so powerful. I've used this example in a number of cases in the globalization, the first couple lectures I gave on globalization, about extraordinarily powerful companies. Companies that exercise significant amounts of market leverage and can in some cases do good or in some cases do bad. The statistic that was given in the book that I thought was quite dramatic was to say in 2011, the 50 biggest multinational companies had financial holdings bigger than the smallest 113 states. In other words, if you're looking at the Apples and the Amazons and the Googles of the world, the financial capacity that they hold is greater than most sub-Saharan African states. They're point blank wealthier than those states, wealthier than a lot of African states, wealthier than a lot of states in South America. That means that they are important global actors. And one of the great challenges to realism as a theory is to say, well, how does this make sense that realism only considers states when you're excluding from the analysis a series of companies and corporations that actually have greater financial holdings than many, many states? And transnational companies can, in fact, actually do this. Interestingly enough, NGOs, you could also argue, are larger as well. Some NGOs have memberships in the millions. And so you can make an argument that on sheer numbers, on sheer dollars, a lot of these nonprofit organizations are bigger than states. There is a little bit of a conceit here. If you think about it for a second, why are we taking an extraordinarily small state like San Marino or Luxembourg more seriously than we take the preferences of Apple or Google? Who has more money and who has more numbers, right? I mean, in some of these cases, they have more money and they have more numbers. And so there is an argument to say that some of these organizations can actually produce quite substantial political change. And we're going to talk a little bit about how, in fact, they've actually done that. Many of these companies, transnational companies, are a serious challenge to the notion of sovereignty of the state. This is something that there is an old tradition of very large private transnational companies. Early examples of this, like the East India Company, the British East India Company, and some of the companies that were involved in colonialism did challenge the borders of the sovereign state. Increasingly, what we see now is globalization has produced a world of very, very, very large multinational corporations. Amazon, Apple, Google, very, very large companies. But there are a series of others. Some of the OPEC and petroleum producing companies, companies like Exxon, these are extraordinarily powerful. They're very large banks. These companies have a tremendous amount of political power, and they're often able to sort of leverage governments in a couple different ways. The conventional term for these are transnational companies. What do we mean by transnational companies?
Well, we hold assets in various nations, not just their home nation.
Yeah. What you come back with these notions of these companies is a transnational company has assets and in some cases command or headquarters or important divisions in multiple companies. And that's the case if you were to look at most of the major banks. You look at something like UBS, you look at something like Santander Bank. Most of them, they might be headquartered in Spain, but they have significant assets in London, significant assets in Frankfurt, significant assets in New York. And so you see these companies that are in multiple sets of jurisdictions. That's the difference between a transnational company and an entirely national company. Most companies that you are buying things from now increasingly are transnational companies. They're no longer located in the borders of the United States alone or in the borders of any particular state. They are located in multiple cases. This is particularly the case if you measure inputs. If you take the inputs of a company and take the fact that most companies use contractors or subsidiaries for some of their inputs, it's very hard to find a company that works entirely within the borders of the national state. This is really important. If you were to go back 100 years, most companies operate within the borders of the sovereign state. Today, even look at something like Starbucks, right? If you were to walk down and look at the Starbucks, how many different countries do you think contribute to the input of the Starbucks, right?
Yeah, they talked about this because, like you said, so now the economies are so intertwined because, you know,
because you've got so many inputs. So think about something even simple as a coffee shop. You might be importing the coffee beans from countries like Ethiopia and East Timor. You might be buying your plastic mugs from places like China. You're using U.S. labor. You're headquartered and you pay taxes in multiple different countries with multiple different sets of subsidiaries. I mean, what you actually have there is a case where the inputs to the company make the company fundamentally a transnational company more than a national company. Many of the companies that we are used to assuming are predominantly American, Amazon and Apple, Starbucks, for example, McDonald's, they are, but they have very substantial international holdings and in many cases foreign headquarters as well. And so it's very difficult to consider most of these companies kind of national assets. And that poses real interesting problems for them in a couple different cases. What's also interesting about this is that although there is limited corpuses of law at the international level, for the most part, economic regulation of these companies is done at the national level. This poses a really serious problem for governments. You know, if you're a government like the United States, you might have a very sophisticated regulatory framework, but you are dealing with a very large company that has the ability to shift assets. And so if I want to regulate Amazon, I have a serious problem in the fact that Amazon can move assets relatively easily from other countries, or move between states. You saw this. How many of you guys are familiar with the fight over sales tax in Amazon? Right, Amazon, for a long time, you didn't pay sales tax because it was an online retailer, and the argument was it wasn't located in any particular place. States fought for about 10 years to get Amazon to concede the fact that they would pay sales tax. And now you pay state-based sales tax for Amazon. And Amazon, for the longest time, argued, look, I'm an online retailer. I'm not located in any one state, so therefore I'm not obliged to pay state taxes. The problem was local domestic retailers were losing out to Amazon because the price of the same CD was cheaper at Amazon because I didn't have to pay sales tax. And as a result, local manufacturers pushed for Amazon to pay taxes. And Amazon successfully managed not to do that for a very long period of time, and still, in fact, tried to evade it in a lot of other countries. It's very difficult to get some of these countries to be willing to participate. And it's very hard to insist on corpus of law or uniform standards when, for the most part, they're subject to national jurisdiction. Very hard to do that. Impossible, but hard. And so many companies actually have quite a bit of leverage for this. If you think about tax law in particular, what you can really see is that many of these companies take advantage of tax laws, and that actually generates quite a bit of leverage on local governments. Apple's famous for this, Amazon's famous for this, Google is also famous for this. Almost all of these are American-born companies, but they have very substantial European tax divisions. Well, it raises the question, who do they pay taxes to? And how can they exploit different sets of tax loopholes in order to pay less tax? You often hear stories about large corporations in Europe paying almost no tax. The Europeans, the British particularly, launched a campaign because Starbucks was essentially paying almost no tax in the UK.
Yeah, this makes you harken back to the times of the robber barons. Just because these companies are so big, they're bigger than most states, and I mean, they could, like you said, they can move their assets around from different places.
Yeah, they can move assets, and it's not easily, right? You can't move your Starbucks that's based in
I
London.
mean, yeah, but
But you can move your tax holdings, you can move your financial holdings, you can move a lot of things. And part of what goes on here is there's a lot of double taxation agreements. And so if you're taxed in the United States, you shouldn't be taxed in Britain, and vice versa. So double taxation agreements, and then the way that the laws are written to allow them to exempt certain kinds of activity from the taxes themselves mean that the net effect, once you take out all of the deductions that are available for them in the tax code, many of these companies pay very, very little in tax. And part of what's going on here is that they are able to move between jurisdictions. It's very hard to stop a transnational company that can move between jurisdictions. This is the case for very powerful states in the United States and Europe. Now think about what that is for the case in the developing world. States with fewer financial resources, states with lower West state capacity, states where the regulators are not able to operate in the same way, very difficult to be able to do it. Many of these companies engage in what's known as intra-firm trade. They trade within the units themselves, and they shift productions within the units themselves. This allows them to evade a lot of labor regulations and also to evade a lot of tax regulations. Apple does this. Apple's a US-based headquarters, but it makes almost nothing in the United States. It makes most of its production in China, and it harvests a lot of resources for the iPhone that's in your pocket from Africa. Very difficult to find how you would sort of regulate a company like Apple. That's actually why they stopped selling the iPods. Some of the metals, the rare metals that were used in the iPods, were getting really, really expensive. They stopped selling some of the iPods, and they changed around that rare metals that were used. But a company like Apple is based in the United States. It stores in the United States, but the production is in a facility in China, and the resource extraction is in Africa, and then it has subsidiaries in Europe. Very difficult to find a way that a government can get a handle on that, because what it has the ability to do is if you're taxed or regulated too heavily in one environment, then in fact actually you can shift. Not always easily, there are costs associated with it, but you can in fact actually shift it. Certainly you can shift if the part becomes more expensive. And what you see is a lot of these companies shift production based on where the part is less expensive to make, so it makes it very easy for them to essentially move around. The result is that it's very hard for governments to regulate a lot of these large transnational companies. They try to co-opt them, but they have a very hard time trying to regulate them because they have an ability to do so. Arguably also, the fact that they are able to shift assets and to shift labor between the companies themselves means that there's a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards, right? What do we mean by that? What's a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards? Why would there be a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards?
So like figuring out what labor's gonna be like cheapest and like finding like I don't know, it's in my head, I'm trying to figure out how to say. It's like trying to find which labor is going to be cheapest in what country and then figure out the labor standards essentially.
Yeah, it's trying to figure out where the marginal cost of the labor will be the lowest and trying to figure out where you're in the most favorable regulatory environment. This is why, for the most part, you see much of the production happening in the developing world, even for high-end technology, because I can pay people less, the regulatory environment's less, I don't have to provide them health care, I don't have to provide pensions, I can have much longer working hours, I don't need to have the insurance protections on labor. And so you see a lot of cases under which much of the production in the developing world is a race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. This produces a real problem for large enough governments. If you're a government like the United States or the European Union, you want to keep production in your company, in your country. Labor is going to be more expensive, regulation is going to be more expensive, and you know that the company has the ability to shift assets and has the ability to shift production. And if it can do so, they can evade the regulation. Right? And that's producing a real sort of pressure. So these companies have considerable amounts of power and considerable amounts of ability to be able to do so. Arguably, this is leading to a lot of pressure. Increasingly, there's a consumer movement to say, well, maybe we should be trying to fight the race to the bottom in terms of labor standards. Maybe just instead of accepting that we build things in factories where people work tremendous numbers of hours, that we should start to be engaged in some kind of commercial pressure where you vote with your wallet and you no longer do so. Increasingly, companies are coming under pressure from nonprofit organizations who say it's not sustainable that you pay your workers in this way, and we don't want to, in fact, actually allow you to do so. Right? So we're beginning to see a shift away from companies, and some companies are getting ahead of this. Actually, interestingly enough, Google and a couple of other companies are getting ahead of this, saying, hey, listen, we're going to make our goods, but we're not going to make them in these factories, we're going to pay high labor standards. I think the most interesting one is Starbucks. What is Starbucks' labor practices? Anybody know? They're actually not bad relative to most of the rest. Starbucks pays college credit. Starbucks pays college credit and provides healthcare. And the reason Starbucks does is not because Starbucks is a particularly generous corporation, it's because it recognized that the political costs of continuing to have people refusing to buy their product and to treat them as a sign, as a symbol of evil globalization, was getting high. So they wanted to produce a kind of kinder face to corporate production. And they offer college credits to employees, they provide healthcare that a lot of other players do. Apple still doesn't. Apple still actually does most of its production in Chinese factories, has people working 17, 18 hours a day for very, very low wages. And the problem is that if you try and pin Apple, where are you going to pin Apple? The US headquarters, the European headquarters, the Chinese production facilities? And what do you do to the cost of production if the cost of labor production in China is so low that you can't get it moving to the United States? This is something Trump is running across, that you have this problem where production shifts in the developing world, very difficult for you to find a way around that. Part of the problem with this is that the blunt taxes and tariffs that you might slap on to a lot of the production of this are hard to do because the companies can shift it, they violate some WTO rules, and they're often imposed on workers. Right? So they're often translated into workers and translated into higher tariffs. We talked about this with Mexico. If Trump imposes a 30% tariff on Mexico to build the wall, you're all going to pay the price for this. So the consumers will pay the price for this, it'll penalize Mexican workers, and the companies will shift the burden. The larger, more powerful transnational companies, the more easy it is for them to shift the burden. It's very easy for them to move the burden of labor and resources, harder for them, in fact, actually to do so. The other thing when you think about these companies is that these companies can engage in what's known as triangulation. And triangulation is where you ship goods to other companies, you ship goods through another country for sale. So if you're trying to impose labor standards on me, I ship it through another country and then that country resells it. Triangulation Triangulation makes regulation on these companies extraordinarily difficult to do. And because the volume of trade, it's very hard to regulate triangulation. And so this means that a lot of companies pose a real problem for governments. If you want to try and regulate sort of coffee production and make sure coffee production isn't done in an exploitative way, if the coffee production is done in an exploitative way through a subsidiary company, then it's sold through a European company which is sold to the United States, it's very hard to regulate it. That's triangulation. You pass it through other companies. You pass the goods through other companies. Most of us are only scarcely aware of what the goods that we actually buy, how they are made, the conditions of the workers, and so on. So triangulation makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to try and do so. Interestingly enough, this is a big problem with oil sanctions. Oil is remarkably easy to shift through international markets. So what you tend to see with oil production is when you slap sanctions onto oil production, the oil companies are very effective at passing it through a third country. So I might be harvesting Sudanese oil that's in violation of a ban, I pass it through Iraq. Or I might be harvesting Iraqi oil, I pass it through another country in the Gulf and I sell it to U.S. crude. We found out during the 1990s that many Americans were purchasing Iraqi oil despite the fact there was a ban on Iraqi oil. We were purchasing large amounts of Iraqi oil. Why? Triangulation, sold it through a third company. Very, very difficult to track. You can do it with intelligence agencies, very difficult to do. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why companies are spied on by the U.S. government, to find these things out, right, and to produce their evidence of that. The other leverage point that companies have is what's called regulatory arbitrage, which is where they are able to shop for favorable regulatory and tax environments. Companies can actually move their operations for favorable regulatory and tax environments. And this poses tremendous amounts of problems for governments in a way essentially to try and make their tax environments business friendly. It also creates a disincentive to close tax loopholes. There are huge numbers of tax loopholes that exist for a lot of companies. Very difficult to be able to shut those tax loopholes if they can move, particularly within a geographic region. I'll give you a nice example of this. What's happening with the City of London? Anybody know what's happening with the City of London and its move and its future post-Brexit? Well, what's the City of London? You guys know this. We talk about the City of London. Christina, what's the City of London? I can see you nodding. What's the City of London? Well, arguably, it's a city. Can we say that term? Anybody know? If you live in London itself, almost the entire central financial district of the banks are known as the City of London. If you ever read that in a British newspaper, they're talking about the concentration of capital. London is the financial capital of Europe, and it is the headquarters of most of the large banks of the European continent. Many of the biggest international banks, Lloyd's TSB, Royal Bank of Scotland, a whole series of other international companies, Santander, plus American corporations like Citibank, Deutsche Bank, and so on, they're all based in the City of London. You often hear this phrase, the City of London. Well, under British tax law, they are given tremendous amounts of favorable tax positions. They are given tax loopholes, they are given property abatements, they are given plenty of tax abatements on share earnings, and so on. Post-Brexit, they're suddenly facing a much more unfavorable tax environment. The British state has said, once we are now allowed to change the regulatory environment for Brexit, we are going to find ways to tax you. And if you're in the City of London, what happens if you're no longer part of the European Common Market? You actually start to pay a higher price to do financial transactions in the European Common Market. So what did the City of London companies start to do? Where are they going? You know where they're going? They're all looking into real estate in Frankfurt. And it's causing a really substantial problem for the British state. The British government is panicked. I mean, you go through Brexit, you get a vote to leave the European Union, it denies the City of London access to the common market, they're going to pay higher transaction costs, they suddenly move. What happens if you lose the City of London? Much of London's revenue disappears, and much of London's revenue subsidizes a lot of the social welfare payments paid in the rural regions of Britain. Right? Losing the City of London is extraordinarily important. And what's in fact they're facing is the exact example of sort of tax shopping and regulatory shopping. If I'm going to face higher tax environment and a tougher regulatory environment in a post-Brexit Britain, I move to Frankfurt, Germany. I relocate my headquarters, and Britain has stopped having to try and induce them back. The result is that Britain has offered better tax concessions to these companies rather than get them leave. They're trying to make it more favorable for them to stay. And that's the kind of leverage that we're holding. There are some limited cases under which companies can be subject to extraterritorial jurisdiction. That is to say, jurisdiction by a U.S. court in a UK operation or a U.S. court in a Chinese operation. But generally speaking, extraterritorial jurisdiction is not universally accepted, and it's difficult to do for companies. So companies can possess tremendous amounts of resources. As a result of the fact that they get a lot of these these advantages, many companies are under considerable pressure to show that they have some social benefit, that they are not just kind of rapacious capitalists, and they're engaging in things like called corporate social responsibility. What is corporate social responsibility? Talk about that.
I guess like Starbucks hiring refugees and hiring veterans.
Yeah, Starbucks is a fantastic example of this. What a lot of companies are starting to do is to build corporate social welfare responsible units and good governance units that are saying, okay, how can we use the resources of our company for good? Now, in part, what they're trying to do there is sometimes to produce political change. Companies will join in to support larger transnational efforts. We see this actually today. There are a number of companies that have come out in support of the immigrant walk-off. Are you guys familiar with this today? Apparently, immigrants are walking up the business. A number of companies have come out and say, look, we supported immigration. We support people trying to make a living in this country. We're now going to support it. We're not going to penalize our workers. Right? That's an example of something a corporate social responsibility would do. Starbucks' PR efforts to hire refugees, 10,000 refugees being hired at Starbucks, is a wonderful example of corporate social responsibility. Why are they doing so? They're doing so because they have market power. If you have market power and you're in a favorable regulatory environment, you might find ways under which you can exercise corporate social responsibility. Amazon does this with some charitable donations. Amazon's okay about this. Starbucks has done quite a bit on this. Microsoft does a tremendous amount of donations through Bill Gates' own foundation, but also independently through Microsoft for relief in Africa. How many of you are familiar with Red Bono's initiative? Right, this is an example of corporate social responsibility. What you see is a lot of companies get together and say, we're going to give the tax proceeds, or we're going to give some percentage of the sale proceeds from the purchase of these goods to dealing with HIV/AIDS in Africa. And the idea is to get out ahead of the fact that there are a lot of things these companies can do to exercise leverage in politics. And increasingly, companies are starting to say to themselves, how can I be an engine for social good? What can I do that would produce an engine of social good? I'll give you a really nice example of this, one that I happen to know a little bit personally about. I happen to know, just married to an old friend of mine from England, is a guy who is the VP for Corporate Social Responsibility of Google in Europe. And when I was talking to him this summer in London, I was saying to him, what are you thinking about doing, and what are you guys trying to do at the moment? He said, what Google's doing that no one knows they're doing is they're spending tremendous amounts of money to go make sure that there are Wi-Fi hookups for refugees coming in across the Mediterranean and email terminals. Now, why would you do that? And what he said is when they actually interview a lot of the refugees that come in from places like Syria and Libya, and they wind up in Italy, and they wind up in Spain, and they wind up along the Balkans or in the Greek islands, they often come in, and what's the very first thing you want to do? You put your kid in a boat, you're escaping Syria, you want to get over across the ocean, you're in a rickety boat where you paid for blackmailed, you paid for sort of black market transfer into Europe. You're now an illegal immigrant into Europe. What do you want to do? Let people know you're okay. And he was actually finding that one of the biggest demands of refugees that most of the traditional refugee companies were not, refugee agencies were dealing with Wi-Fi access. People want to be able to email home. They want to be able to Skype and say, the kids got here to Italy safely. And so what Google started to do was say, well, what we're going to start to do as a part of our corporate social responsibility is we're going to start to pay for terminals, Wi-Fi access that are freely available for refugees, and they started setting up stations where people could contact home, they could Skype their parents, and so on. Right? That's a perfect example of corporate social responsibility. And I said to him at the time, well, why do you think Google's doing this? Is this an entirely humanitarian gesture? And his argument was, it's a humanitarian gesture in the sense that the people doing it at Google believe it. But it's also a case under which it's a branding gesture. Right? If you're looking at Google as the big bad company that evades taxes in Europe, if you can point to a number of things for corporate social responsibility, you're going to begin to see that these companies are able to produce some kind of social change. And increasingly, these companies are working with governments. They're aligning with governments to find out ways under which they can produce good forms of social change. So you're seeing a case under which it's moving from just charity, which you almost always got from companies, to cases under which transnational activism begins to kick into, and these countries begin to work with other forms of issue advocacy. Generally speaking, they try to avoid high-profile or highly political issues. It's not a good idea for governments. Simple humanitarianism is easier. Something like dealing with HIV/AIDS in Africa and trying to make sure that we get malaria, and that's a relatively clean form of corporate social activism. Very few people can object to this. This is not something you get political objectivism. It's interesting at the moment, the companies are in a really fascinating position. Do you work with Trump or not? A lot of them are dealing with this, and they're good governance and global social responsibility. Trump has said he wants to work with a lot of these companies to try and figure out how you can bring back jobs to the United States and produce social good. And they're in this interesting position where do they engage with the Trump administration or not? Elon Musk has come in and has started to do tech advising for the Trump administration, and he got criticized by a number of different people and came out out with a statement saying, what would you rather me do? Would you rather me not do it? Would you rather someone who knows less about this than me do it? And so you have this interesting position. Companies are often put in a very interesting position. Politically, they need to position themselves in a way that they're doing good-natured activism or well-intentioned activism that shields a lot of the sort of criticism that we get for the tax triangulation, regulatory arbitrage, and otherwise, and be able to find ways under which they produce kind of corporate social responsibility. And in many cases, they can fund tremendous amounts of good if they choose to do so. And there really is variation. If any of you guys are interested in this, go on, take a major company like McDonald's, pick a major company like Microsoft, go on and look for the corporate social responsibility statement, go and look for the global governance statement, the good governance statement. You're going to see they support good governance, they support tax, they're going to talk about what they do with corporate social responsibility. This is an attempt to engage in kind of transnational activism. And increasingly, they're starting to do it in ways to get ahead of issues. I'll give you a fascinating one I was looking at recently. Facebook, Google, the ACLU, Human Rights Watch, Amazon, and a number of others have joined together on a partnership on artificial intelligence. Right? And why are they doing this? They do this because they recognize that artificial intelligence is the next step for where a lot of computers are going, a lot of drones are going, a lot of forms of robotics. They recognize that there are serious ethical issues involved in autonomously or artificial intelligence with robotics. They want to be ahead of this, so they start to work with transnational, international organizations in an attempt to develop a code of practice. Another interesting way to think about this is a lot of companies have signed up to what's called the Global Compact. The Global Compact is a statement on labor standards, a statement on healthcare standards, a statement of corporate good governance that they believe that they should belong to, and it's a way of cleansing their own records, right? It's a way of engaging in some social good, it's a way of cleansing their own records. Okay, when we think about international advocacy networks and global civil society, the second major component of this is non-governmental organizations, and broadly speaking, you can think of NGOs as really one of two different categories. They can be NGOs within the domestic context of the state that might have an international interest, or they can be what we call international NGOs. International NGOs work much the same as transnational companies. They're headquartered in multiple different jurisdictions. So you might have an Amnesty International headquarters in New York, an Amnesty International headquarters in London, an Amnesty International headquarters in multiple sets of places. Increasingly, these organizations have begun to have a formal UN recognition. The UN now recognizes some NGOs as official partners. And the UN actually is now giving status to NGOs. As you can see in the book, they were talking about the NRA now as an organization that has status with the UN, right? And there's a series of credentials that you need and criteria you must meet. Increasingly, these NGOs are working in ways to produce on certain campaigns. So the NGOs have their own individual programs, but they will join together on types of campaigns. The campaign about artificial intelligence and autonomy is one of the most important ones in the contemporary world, but there's some others that are important. What was the Global Jubilee campaign in 2000? The campaign to solve poverty, extreme poverty in 2000. A number of international NGOs and nonprofit organizations, both domestically and internationally, linked up to try and raise attention to poverty issues and to force governments to increase the amount of aid they were giving to deal with extreme poverty. And in practice, that's been one of the most successful efforts. If you were to go back and look at what countries have done on extreme poverty in the last 15 years, Jeffrey Sachs always points out, you guys are living in a period of time where extreme poverty has dove more than any other part in any other time in history. Fewer countries today are living in extreme poverty than they've ever done before. And in part, it's due to transnational activism. It's due to the fact that these NGOs are spending a lot of time pressuring governments to find ways to do it. The Landmines Convention is an important one as well, because the Landmines Convention, until about 1997, 1998, governments were free to use landmines. They actually produced a very substantial normative change against landmines. Today, almost no government is willing to use landmines except North Korea. North Korea uses them. The U.S. refuses to sign up to the convention, in part because we want the ability to use landmines if we want to. We almost never sign up to conventions. That's our general rule of thumb. We almost always say, we think this is a really good idea, but we're not going to sign it. But we think it's a really good idea. That's the U.S. general position. The U.S., North Korea, but a very small number of other states are still formally on the books as able to use landmines. The U.S. can do it, but doesn't do it. The North Koreans actually do it on the DMZ. They actually lay landmines. And the argument is, well, why would you ban landmines? Why particularly landmines?
They also affect civilians.
Yeah, they very much affect civilians. The evidence suggests that landmines have a much greater sort of lasting effect on wars because they leave landmines intact. There's almost no records where landmines are. And so today, the statistic is that Afghanistan had 3 million landmines left in it at the end of the Soviet invasion. And you can find plenty of cases of stories of Afghan children being blown up just walking in a field, or being dismembered walking in a field because landmines were left during the Soviet invasion. Increasingly, what happened in 1997, 1998 is a number of NGOs, including Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, got together in a global campaign to force states to abandon the use of landmines. And the idea is that what they highlighted was the impact on the civilian population. Not the military utility, but rather the impact on the civilian population. The fact that you had that happen for a very long period of time. One of the ones that I've had some dealings with recently is the campaign to stop killer robots. A number of organizations working on this. And generally speaking, they have found that the international NGOs, it works better when you can connect it to a campaign, when you can connect it to a global coalition. The ban to stop killer robots is designed to stop the creation of military robots that have artificial intelligence and are able to target on their own. And we are not that far away from that. There are mini Terminators that exist that can, in fact, actually kill without someone on the trigger. The U.S. military official position is that we will not engage in the creation of artificial intelligence. We will not create artificial intelligence that can kill. We will create artificial intelligence, however. So they're endorsing the creation of artificial intelligence. They actually, in practice, have that. They don't want to create it in a way under which it's able to make the decision on what to target. And part of the reason they don't want to is because they can't, side note, they can't control who it'll kill. If you give it a simple command that says, kill the bad guys, it might not decide that the enemy's the bad guy. Or if you say kill the biggest threat, it may decide you're the biggest threat. And so one of the problems they have with this is trying to figure out if you actually sort of create artificial intelligence and you give it the autonomous right to kill, how do you stop it if it starts to kill your own people? And how do you stop it if it goes a bit haywire? I read this piece the other day that this was alarming. Google had created artificial intelligence. And the artificial intelligence, just giving you guys, I know you guys don't like transnational activism, so I'm doing my best to make this interesting. Google had created artificial intelligence, and it put it through an iterative game where it kept losing, and it found that when artificial intelligence kept losing, it kept losing the game that it was playing, it started to take increasingly aggressive and hostile moves. It's perfectly consistent with its programming. If you program something and say don't lose, and get more aggressive and do more aggressive plays if you don't lose, what's it going to do? The more it loses, the more you put it in a position, the more aggressive and hostile it gets. And this is where a lot of NGOs are saying, wait a minute, this is really dangerous. If you go to the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots website, it's a series of European, largely based NGOs in Geneva saying we have to stop this before it starts.
Have you heard of the theory that like if you program the artificial intelligence to like do whatever you want, like most efficient as possible, it'll like determine that like humans are like the inefficiency and it'll just like wipe out all of mankind?
Yeah, I mean, there are some people who argue that these kind of science fiction fantasies are just that, they're just fantasies. It's interesting, there's some very smart robotics people who say they're not, that they actually may calculate things like that you're the inefficiency or you're the greatest danger. The U.S. military's answer is we need artificial intelligence because increasingly war will get so fast that the Chinese are working with artificial intelligence and we're working with artificial intelligence. If they're moving faster than where our pilots can actually physically move, we need somebody who can adapt that fast. The problem is you're going to get to a point where when other states start to get artificial intelligence and they start to deploy it, the U.S. is going to be in no position to say no. And so then you come to this question of can you build kind of guardrails for it? Can you build something that says, never kill a human, for example? If you go back to the fundamental laws of robotics together in Asimov and others, can you get a condition under which you never kill human beings? The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots people argue, no, you can't. That there's no effective set of logical rules or algorithmic rules that are going to be able to stop you from trying to kill, and that you shouldn't worry about it. Now, friends of mine who defend autonomy always argue, planes are semi-autonomous. Planes are semi-autonomous in the sense that you get on a plane, much of that's running on autopilot. Most of the operations are autopilot. Artificial intelligence is different. Artificial intelligence gives it the ability to adapt. And some of them argue, well, artificial intelligence isn't bad. If I teach my plane that if there's an object flying at my engine, I go like this, right? That's not a bad thing for the plane automatically to learn. And if it goes faster than a human can move, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe. There's a lot of people concerned to say once you open up this sort of Pandora's box, what you're going to start to get is real serious adverse consequences, right? And so what's happening is you're seeing a collection of NGOs based largely in Geneva, but some of them are headquartered in New York, some of them are lawyers based in Washington, some of them are working with governments, some of them are outside of governments, and largely they're including scientists, like collections of scientists, that are now writing to government saying, we want you to agree on a preemptive ban on artificial intelligence. We don't mind if you have limited autonomy, but nothing that involves the direct use of violence against human beings. you should authorize no R&D that's allowed to do that. And at the moment, the Pentagon is complying, but Trump has not said, well, he'll continue to comply. Right? So you might wind up getting stuff like this. That's what's happening. Some NGOs actually, in part because they are treated like international organizations, become what are known as hybrid NGOs. This is where they are given the status of an international organization, but they're technically a nonprofit. I think the most interesting example of this is the International Committee on the Red Cross. The International Committee on the Red Cross is treated like an international organization from a legal vantage point, and yet it's technically a nonprofit or NGO organization. And the International Committee on the Red Cross manages to exert considerable pressure on governments. Notice with the ICRC, it is not a nationally based organization. Right? It is based in multiple headquarters. Like any transnational company, it has multiple sets of offices, and it's able to produce social and political change as a result of it. And the ICRC is very effective in this. We'll talk about how the ICRC does that. There are cases under which governments will actually grant some of these organizations limited voting rights in UN organizations. We've actually gotten to a point now where sometimes nonprofit organizations are invited within the context of international organizations and given votes on legislation. The UN often does this. If it's creating a code on labor standards, it'll invite in a series of nonprofit organizations or NGOs that work on labor standards to scrub the text and to make sure that they're comfortable with the text before it gets forward to governments. So this notion that government preferences always drive outcomes is clearly not true. You're living in a world in which international organizations will work with NGOs to produce text that then binds governments. One of the ways to understand these nonprofit organizations is that they are norm entrepreneurs. And by that is a term of art that essentially what we mean is they are trying to ground new norms for state behavior. Think about the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. What are they trying to do? They're trying to find ways under which you would stop states from engaging in a kind of form of autonomous warfare that they think is dangerous. Landmines is another wonderful example of this. They know that there's no legal penalty. At the end of the day, if the U.S. wants to use landmines, they can't hold the U.S. legally responsible. What they can do is create a norm against it that makes it costly for the U.S. to do it. And so much of this is not about the creation of formal legal rules, it's rather the creation of norms more than anything else. One of the interesting norms that I think has been fascinating to watch, if you watch the international NGOs that are pushing, a lot of the environmental NGOs have pushed for conservation and particularly the push a norm against the trafficking in items taken, rare items taken from endangered species. Think about tusks from elephants. It used to be the case that you could take the tusk from an elephant and buy it in a market in Thailand. And increasingly what's happened is a whole series of environmental conservation NGOs have got together to start to try and create attention on trafficking in rare animals, also indeed human trafficking, and to create norms under which states might not want to do so. And now states are encouraged to sign up to voluntary compliance regimes where they will say, I will no longer engage in this activity. I will no longer allow rare animals to be sold in my property. I will no longer allow goods that are made from elephants, for example, to be sold in commercial markets. The U.S. no longer allows you to buy that. You can't buy goods made from elephants in the United States, at least legally. Right? And it's in part because it's norm entrepreneurship. What they're trying to do is push states to try and do that. Human trafficking is another example of this. Human trafficking, I think, is fascinating. A number of NGOs have said there is still an enormous problem in trafficking, particularly of women and children, and sex trafficking. They've drawn attention to it. They've pressured governments. They've gotten governments to sign up with voluntary standards on human trafficking, and increasingly they've gotten companies to do voluntary standards on human trafficking. We're organizing through the Political Science Department a couple days on human trafficking in early April to draw attention to it, and the Christian Brothers are going to bring in an organization that actually does training on how you spot human trafficking. Increasingly what's happening is nonprofits are working with companies to figure out, if you're a hotel clerk or an airline stewardess, how do you see when a woman's being trafficked? What signs do you pay attention to? What forms of behavior signal this? And this is another example where governments are working with NGOs and corporations to do norm entrepreneurship, to get to the point where that begins to change behavior, right? And to get to the point where it begins to change the way you think about this. Interestingly enough, when you think about norm entrepreneurship happens in ways that realism can't predict. Realism tells you power dictates outcomes, but increasingly powerful states receive the norms but don't create them. The United States oftentimes is forced to adopt the norms, it doesn't often create them. What you often see is states like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Canadians, they spend a lot of time on norm entrepreneurship. Right? The UN always jokes about this. These are the good countries, the nice countries. They've got really high standards of living, and they always do like good, nice things. Countries like the United States are often forced to take these. Britain, forced to take these. You wouldn't think powerful states are forced to take norms from weaker states, but in fact they are because of transnational pressure. How, in fact, did they actually do this? Part of the way they do this is essentially information gathering and communication. nonprofit transnational organizations, strictly speaking, have no power. They can sue governments. Amnesty sue governments all the time. The ACLU sues governments all the time. They can sue governments. That's one way they can try and do it. But you have to have standing in the court. You have to have cases to be able to do so. You can't just sue governments capriciously. Increasingly, the way they do it is political communication and advocacy. They raise attention among the general population. They work with celebrities to get attention in the general population. And then that produces pressure on governments. And that's essentially a way of you communicating effectively to get what you want and essentially to gain status to be able to do so. One way people describe this is moral arbitrage. They try and become arbiters of moral positions. And they try to essentially find ways under which, if they are able to be arbiters of moral positions, they are able to force companies and force governments to comply. I'll give you a nice example of this to think a little bit about it. What's PETA? Anybody know?
They protect animal rights, so they make awareness for animal rights, and they do like really big campaigns, and like a lot of times they're like risque or they're like controversial.
Yeah, the people for the ethical treatment of animals, right? They're a big one. What they often do is they pressure companies, they pressure organizations and governments to treat animals better. And what you increasingly see now is that films, for example, that make films involving animals will bring in PETA as a consultant. And what you actually see there is that PETA is essentially positioning itself as a moral arbiter. And companies, filmmakers like something like Warner Brothers might say, I'm going to make a movie, and I don't want to get in trouble with the animal rights people. I'm going to bring in PETA as a consultant to make sure that I'm treating the animals well. And therefore, that moral arbitrage provides cover for the company. Increasingly, you see this. You see this in cases of labor standards. They'll invite labor standards in. And this is a position of moral arbitrage. What you do is you take your position as an organization and you offer your services to scrub governments of any kind of conflicts of interest or scrub governments of any kind of bad behavior. From a company's vantage point, it's really smart. You don't ever want to wind up like that film A Dog's Life did, where they were accused of abusing a dog. What do? You bring in animal rights organizations, they scrub your behavior. And you see governments are starting to do this now. They're inviting in international nonprofits to look at, for example, their codes on the law of war. The U.S. military did this recently. When they were doing their code on their manual on counterinsurgency, they invited in a series of human rights organizations and the International Committee of Red Cross to look at their procedures on interrogating personnel.
When did these organizations start getting this kind of like influence over companies and whatnot?
Really about the late 80s. This is a relatively new development. The notion that you have a transnational civil society, if you were to go back into the 50s and the 60s, there really wasn't much of a transnational civil society. Some of these organizations existed, but they were relatively small. 70s into the 80s through the 90s and 90s, they really exploded. They started to grow in number. And increasingly, they're more and more important. And increasingly, they work with governments, and they have regular contacts with governments at the functional level. And this is where, when we start to try to amend the realist model tells you, look, states matter and it's power. Well, states do matter, and states might be the first among equals, but increasingly, if Human Rights Watch is able to be an arbiter of how I'm treating people, or if I want to make sure that my prisons are compliant with internal standards, you can apply a lot of normative pressure. Right? Now, in practice, if you have a government that simply does not care about normative pressure, if you're North Korea, it's not going to do much. But if you are a government that is sensitive to public perceptions, these things can matter quite a bit. And you can find cases under which governments will essentially try to make sure their behavior is consistent with external standards. Right? And that's what they're eventually trying to do. Moral arbitrage is a really important kind of example to this. And it's a way of protecting governments. I think one of the most interesting ones that I have a little bit of knowledge about is in Guantanamo Bay. You all know that the U.S. was responsible for torture, right? Everybody knows in this room that we torture people in Abu Ghraib and we torture people in Guantanamo Bay. Around 2005, 2006, the Bush administration said, we have to get kind of clean to this. We can't be continually accused of torture. One of the ways that they did this, and one of the ways the Obama administration institutionalized this, was to permit unrestricted access to Guantanamo Bay by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, why would the Bush administration, Obama administration, allow the ICRC into a very secret U.S. government facility that you guys can't walk into? Well, the reason why is because they wanted to be cleaned. They didn't want to be accused of torturing personnel. How do you do that? Bring the ICRC into the tent. And they actually engaged in working groups of the International Committee of the Red Cross to say, okay, if we have this person, we think they're a terrorist suspect, can I do this, but I can't do that? And they get the organizations to sign off on the ICRC on what they generally think is accepted U.S. practice. They built this into a code of practice. This is moral arbitrage. And governments will use this instrumentally to make sure that they're actually getting the kind of support that they do. Human rights organizations are very effective for this. Another way that this happens is what we call transnational issue advocacy networks. These are ways under which nonprofit organizations align with groups of individuals to work on a specific issue by a network. That is to say, it's not just one individual NGO, but they're building a network of NGOs around particular issues. Campaign to Stop Killing Robots is examples of this, and others. Networks generally are different than the way you would see individual governments operate. They're essentially reciprocal, they're horizontal, they work on voluntary association, and they rely on experts to be able to do so. And networks are very effective ways of trying to get transnational advocacy to happen, and you can get a lot of pressure from this. I'll give you some examples of this, where you see networks begin to emerge. One of the interesting networks, I think, is on climate change. A number of organizations that are trying to produce pressure on governments not to take policies that would exacerbate climate change have gotten collections of scientists together for formal statements and formal positions with the National Academy of Sciences and other offices to pressure governments to make an argument that climate change is a scientific consensus. Increasingly, because enemies of climate change come out and say, well, the science isn't essentially agreed, we think there are reasons why the Earth might be getting warmer, but it has nothing to do with man-made activity. That's in violation of the scientific consensus. Overwhelmingly, the scientific consensus is that man-made activity is producing climate change. And so increasingly what transnational issue advocacies do is they say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get a whole series of Nobel Prize-winning scientists together, they're going to produce a statement on climate change, and they're going to do issue advocacy and meetings designed to draw attention to this. And that's a way that you try to get expertise marshaled to pressure governments so that it's harder for a government to turn around and say, climate change doesn't exist. Right? It's harder and harder to do so. If you think this hasn't been successful, it's really interesting. If you were to go back even 20 years ago, there was almost no discussion of climate change. The term climate change began to emerge in about 1997, 1998, late 1990s. By 2000, 2002, 2003, it's increasingly scientific consensus. And one of the most interesting things I thought was that for years, the United States lobby arguing climate change was parts of the United States government denied climate change. The Obama administration accepted climate change as a principle. The Europeans have long accepted it. When the Trump administration said climate change is not a real thing and nominated for the EPA someone who didn't believe climate change is a real thing, the Chinese government came out, which traditionally denied the existence of climate change. The Chinese government came out and said, no, look, it's a real thing. And you guys cannot afford to not pay attention to this. That is norm movement. I mean, if you go from a case under which the Chinese deny the existence of climate change through most of 2000 to the point where they get to 2017 and they're willing to come back to the United States and say, no, that exists, that's normative movement, right? And so that's transnational issue advocacy networks beginning to have some kind of impact. You also see this in cases where Nobel Prize winners will sign on to letters about bioengineering. Increasingly, there's a lot of this work done on bioengineering, where people are saying, like, editing the human genome, creating human cyborgs, finding ways to artificially enhance us. This is stuff that is very, very dangerous to do, and in fact, actually impossible to do. There are some precedents for this. A really interesting precedent for a transnational issue advocacy network, and it's my recurring frustration that people don't pick this up. Anti-slavery coalitions in the 1800s and 1700s. If you go back and look at the early anti-slavery coalitions, it's a really good example of the transnational issue advocacy. Abolitionist movements in Britain, the United States, and a lot of the European countries paid a lot of attention to what was going on in the other countries. So this notion that we've never had kind of transnational issue advocacy networks is not true. We've always had them. They're institutionalized in a way that they haven't been, in fact, actually before. One of the things that's important to understand about the way these issue advocacy networks work is that they work in stages, and policy outcomes is not their first stage. I mean, people who are cynical about this often come back and say, well, I don't see the direct policy outcome as a result of this. It's in part because what they try to do is two things before that. The first is agenda setting. For the most part, transnational advocacy networks put things on the agenda, and then they change the language. They change the discourse. Policy outcome comes later. So the way you really know a transnational advocacy network has been in effect is, are you talking about issues you weren't talking about before, and have you changed the language that you've used to talk about those issues? Did you find ways under which you might be able to do so, and you can start to think about ways in which that kind of happen? If we change the way we talk about climate change is a good example of this, human trafficking is a good example of this, some of the labor standards issues are good about this. Generally speaking, policy changes at a much later point. Transnational issue advocacy networks take a long time. One of the ways they do this is they engage in what's known as symbolic politics. Symbolic politics is where you seize on a symbol of the movement and try and exploit it. Can anybody give me some examples? Occupy Wall Street is sort of a national movement. You could argue it's international. That's got a symbol. Anybody else think of some other symbols of forms of symbolic politics that transnational issue advocacies have worked with? I'll give you a couple. First, think about Coney 2012, right? What was that about?
I was gonna name another one. Just Sweet
Sure.
Charlie.
Okay, Just Sweet Charlie. That has been seized on by sort of global civil society organizations for free speech reasons, right? Think about Coney 2012. What was it about? It was about child trafficking. What do you seize upon? One warlord in Uganda, right? And you make that the issue advocacy. You organize transition issue advocacy around that. Millions of people watch the video.
Whatever happened to the
He still was free for a very long period of time, was eventually arrested by a different government. 2012 didn't actually produce any kind of policy change. I mean, what it did was a lot of people liked it on Facebook, right? And this is the critique of transnational advocacy. A lot of this, people collect the video on Facebook, but they have no idea what country he was in, why he was involved in the Lord's Resistance Army, what the Lord's Resistance Army was, whether child soldiers actually happened to it, whether he was the worst perpetrator, he wasn't. This is the problem with it. People seize on these forms of kind of transnational issue advocacy networks to get people to pay attention to these issues, but sometimes it's very thin forms of politics. It's not always a kind of tremendously important form of politics. Coney 2012 is a really interesting example. Did it raise awareness of child trafficking and child soldiers? Yes, it did. A lot of people clicked the video and said child soldiers are bad. Did it produce political activism? Did it change a law? Got some pressure on some governments. The argument was, I'll get you all to click this video and the government will be responsive to this. The governments were nervous about this for a little while, but they were still unable to get him for a very long period of time, right? It doesn't really change substantial politics in this way. I'll give you another one. That's an interesting example of how they seized upon symbolic politics. Malala Yousafzai, the young woman who was shot by the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? She becomes a kind of cause celebre. She gets into the White House. She gets into meet a whole bunch of celebrities. She becomes an issue advocacy network, and she starts advocating for the rights of women. Right? These are wonderful examples of what you talk about when you form symbolic politics. And oftentimes, transnational issue advocacy networks will look for very clear narratives like this. And the reason they're looking for very clear narratives like this is to get this through the fog of everything else that you're paying attention to, and to get you to pay attention in a simple, dramatic way. Stories about child soldiers, for example. Stories about child soldiers being rehabilitated. This is symbolic forms of politics. The critique that you get, and obviously you guys have picked this up from my slightly cynical take on this, is two things. One is, forms of symbolic politics by transnational issue advocacy networks don't always have lasting impact. If a lot of you do social media activism and you don't actually know anything about it, it doesn't change your behavior, then who cares that you like the Facebook video? It's a lazy form of activism. That's the critique of this. I like it, I don't learn anything more about it. I feel better about myself, I got psychic gratification because I did something good today, but I don't actually learn anything about this, right? That's one critique of it. The second critique is, I think, valuable to think a little bit about, which is about the democratic character of a lot of these organizations. You're living in a world under which Apple and Google have tremendous amounts of power, where groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others do. They will put issues on the agenda, they'll produce policy change. Overwhelmingly, these tend to be Western-based organizations, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly they tend to be. And in most cases, they're not elected. And so there is a question of legitimacy of transnational advocacy networks. They produce social and political change, but they produce social and political change by entrepreneurship, by collections of people who think this is valuable, who force this onto an agenda. It's not self-evident that that represents your political views. It's not self-evident in any kind of way that it represents what, in fact, actually you care about or that anybody elected them to do so. And so one of the big critiques of this is that you're getting political change. The question is, are you getting political change in any kind of way that's sustainable? Right? The amorphous structure of transnational civil society makes it hard to know when you're producing change and who called for the change to happen. There are real legitimacy questions, and increasingly a neo-sovereigntist movement that turns around and says, wait a minute, I shouldn't be listening to a bunch of lawyers in New York, and I shouldn't be listening to a bunch of unelected members of a corporate board. I should be paying attention to citizens, and that's in part the rejection you get in this kind of neo-sovereigntist movement that turns around and says, sovereignty matters, elections matter, I got elected and these organizations didn't. What right do they have to produce political change? Okay, that's it. Thank you, guys. Papers now due on March 2nd. And I will report that the general vote is that I'm bad on technology and getting old. Is that the general vote?
Ooh, it's tough. Right. Silver. It's okay. Excuse me.
lots of